Welcome boys and girls, Christine here with a discussion about the critical issues of the Vampire Coast and some of the things that hopefully Creative Assembly will improve on in a future update. I wouldn't necessarily expect a DLC for the Vampire Coast, but they certainly need an update. Even one on the level of what the Tomb Kings and Lizardmen have gotten, and CA has stated that they're going to do more, at least for the Lizardmen and various hotfixes for the Tomb Kings and various improvements. One of the things to mention about the Vampire Coast, people argue that this is a race that's an Empire destroyer race. It's not about building a lot of territory, it's about destroying other factions. But here's the thing, you need two things to be really effective at that. One, you need really good armies, because you're going to have less armies than other factions. You look at Khorne, you look at Warriors of Chaos. They don't necessarily run around with 100 armies. I mean, you can, especially with Khorne, but that's not what makes Khorne so good at eliminating other factions, that each individual Khorne army is really strong. And two, they do need the ability to maintain a certain number of armies. Not the highest in the world, but a certain level of that. And this is where the Vampire Coast does struggle with significantly. They have severe limitations in terms of their army. Their armies are not really good. You look at mortars, you look at carronades, those are some of the decent units, but their infantry line is fairly weak. Their range line for a range-centric faction is fairly weak. In fact, it's even weaker than the melee line, because at least the melee line does have Depth Guard and Depth Guard with pole arms, even if they are tier 4 and tier 5 respectively. They really should be tier 3 as far as I see it with these units, and maybe a bit cheaper in a campaign. Sure, they're stronger than many other tier 3 units, but not all of them. You look at tier 3, you look at Skull Reapers, you look at Chosen of Khorne. Yeah, those are kind of equivalent. In some ways, Depth Guard have their own advantage, but they also have their disadvantages with regards to that. So you're lacking in many respects with your armies, and then your economy is not capable of supporting a lot of armies. One of the things factions that focus on destroying other factions, including Greenskins, have in common, you look at Khorne, you look at Warriors of Chaos, you look at other factions, they can either maintain those armies by relying on post-battle loot, or they have various ways to reduce upkeep. Various improvements, and significant ones at that. You do have some Horde armies of the Vampire Coast, but it's just not good enough. So there are some key issues with that. The economy is not great, the post-battle loot situation is not great, or rather the income from sacking and looting settlements is not great. Like, I would only gain 1,000. Sure, that's reasonable enough to begin with, but the scalability here is not fantastic. Then you have the obvious things like building tiers, unit tiers, research changes. Those are the more obvious things to talk about. The entire research tree of the Vampire Coast does leave a lot to be desired. But then on top of that, not only is the Vampire Coast economy weaker than other factions, it's not even as good as Norsca, who have a lot of issues themselves, but also fall into that design of a race which is based around looting, sacking settlements. But Norsca can get a lot of money from sacking settlements, far more so than the Vampire Coast, and they can also earn more income from ports, because they can get their max level ports, the third tier of a port, at tier 3. That gives them a significant income benefit, and they also have a lot more income from ports because of the favor of the gods. There's plenty of issues in Norsca, to be sure, but that is one advantage they have. Like, when Norsca is better at the Vampire Coast playstyle than the Vampire Coast, you know something's really wrong with the game. But then you also have the situation of Pirate Coves. So Pirate Coves are pretty useless in a lot of different ways. Setting a lot of these up is pointless. You only have one building slot. Setting these up for economic purposes or corruption purposes or even research, just pretty pointless. Infamy, again, relatively meaningless. The only reason you do care about them is because of Pirates Rest, which is the primary way for you to increase hero capacity for Mongol hunters and gunnery whites. Because unlike many races in the game, including those races focused on settlement destruction, destroying factions, destroying empires, you have very few ways of actually increasing capacity. You can do it through a tier 5 port, you can do it to a degree from horde armies, but you're very, very limited in playing a Vampire Coast campaign in terms of increasing your hero capacity, and a lot of it is tied with... And a lot of it is ultimately tied to the Pirate Coves. So that is not a great system. Also, they do struggle in the whole playstyle of like being raiders, because you attack a settlement, you set up Pirate Coves, great, you're stuck on land for that turn. And you're leaving factions alive, you're stuck on land, you might not even be able to get in the sea back again. So that is a problem. Naval raiding is not actually something they're really good at. That is a problem in general, but Dark Elves, at least to Black Arcs, can actually do it better because they have naval attack. They can encircle a settlement. You can use Black Arcs to dominate the seas far better than the Vampire Coast, just because of the way they work in the game. So that is another critical issue to be talking about. They may get more movement range, but you'll compare this to Dark Elves. Dark Elves are the true naval dominance faction in the game, but they're not exclusively naval dominance, but they really benefit from playing that lower upkeep, various army abilities, far more powerful in a lot of ways than the Vampire Ghost. Pretty good lords, pretty good heroes, a lot of hero capacity, recruitment of all heroes units from that. Yes, you do have a couple of horror armies. Vampire Coast doesn't compare to Dark Elves, because Dark Elves can just get more Black Arcs than them, especially if you're playing at low tier, but not just low tier, because you only have your initial army, you can't confederate other legendary lords, and then you have 4 others that you can get through research. That just takes a good amount of time and takes a good amount of infamy. You do have offices, but honestly, a lot of these offices are not great. Some of them are pretty decent, like Fleet Engineer, pretty good, all things considered. But yeah, a lot of these things are limited. Like, yeah, Fleet Enforcement Admiral, Fleet Engineer, couple of other things, but a lot of these, like half the offices are kind of useless, half of them are pretty good, but you're playing a faction that has limitations on how many armies they can maintain because of their economic situation. You also have to deal with loyalty, which in itself is a very outdated system. Like, and it's kind of the worst situation with loyalty compared to some other factions. So loyalty in itself as a system could be updated. But I do think like they need to improve the battle situation for the Vampire Coast in a campaign. And when I say improve the battle situation, I'm not just talking like, oh, skill lines, research, because that's not going to be relevant in the crucial portion of the campaign, which is very early on. A lot of races can also get much better units as they progress through the campaign with a lot of skill lines and research. So that's just not going to give the Vampire Coast the kind of advantage they need in their campaign. I really think they could use an extra artillery option, but they could really use some buffs with their units, at least from the campaign perspective. I understand that YCA balances certain things in a certain way in a campaign, in the same way that they do for multiplayer, but I think that there should be some difference between multiplayer balance and single player balance, because in single player, having an army that's low leadership, low durability, glass cannon without even a lot of the cannon aspect and a lot of the glass doesn't work out. In particular, when you're thinking about that, the fact that they disintegrate. Their raise dead mechanic is also just far worse than the Vampire Counts, which is a race that hasn't really been updated for a very, very long time. I mean, they got the Bloodlines update with the Vampire Coast DLC, but that's roughly it. Vampire Counts just work really well because they were designed pretty well, and they've stayed relevant throughout all of this. They could use the DLC, they could use their own rework, but Vampire Counts work. And that's not even touching on the subject of Legendary Lord mechanics, because they don't have that. They don't have necessarily a lot of uniqueness. I mean, there are certain playstyles that work better for Noctilus versus Aranessa, versus for Harkon, versus Illustra, but you're lacking in terms of those unique mechanics. On top of that, we should also talk about one of their, unique mechanics as a race, which is treasure maps. These are honestly pretty worthless in terms of rewards. They give you very, very little in terms of money. You do have the doubloons that unlocks Regiments Renown, and that, by the way, is an annoying factor, having to go around the world long distances, defeating certain armies in order to unlock your Regiments Renown, as opposed to how other races work. Vampire Coast is a race that experimented with a lot of mechanics or used mechanics from other races implemented in its own, but those mechanics have been outdated for years for them. And other races just do it better in terms of how they function at the moment. The whole Pirate Coves, well, cults and undercities and the deeps for the dwarves just are far better system. Offices, not really a great system anymore. Honestly, I don't think it ever really was a great system in general in Total War. I can understand the idea, but, you know, needing a certain level of loyalty and ranked in order to put someone in office, just a bit annoying. And it used to be annoying with Karl Franz, but now he just gets electrocount, right? So you just assign people to electrocount positions, so I think the whole offices system is just very, very outdated. It's one of the things I actually dislike about Free Kingdoms. Like, this system just never works well, because by the time you can fill them up and really manage that, well, it's not really managing. It's like, okay, you just want buffs, you put the guy in an office. You're not really managing a government, you're just throwing people into offices once they reach a certain rank, but by the time you fill it up, your campaign is pretty over. It's not relevant when it needs to be relevant. And the lack of confederation between the legendary lords is also a fairly annoying factor. On top of that, we could also talk about the lack of diplomacy options in some ways, like vassalization, that kind of stuff, which Tomb Kings and Vampire Counts do have, which makes their campaigns better for it. Sure, you can abuse it, but it is a system that works pretty well through diplomacy in Warhammer 3. Like, basically, if we're talking about Empire Destroyers, Greenskins, Khorne, hell, Norska even work better. If we're talking about naval dominance factions, Dark Elves just flat out better. And even Norska is better than they are. Ranged army capabilities. Skaven, Empire, Cathay, just do ranged armies, ranged gunpowder armies specifically, better than the Vampire Coast does it. Artillery-wise, yeah, a lot of races have them beat. So they're not excelling in any aspect. I understand the cool aspect, like, you know, undead zombies. Should be cool, should be fun, but it just doesn't work out. And those are the kind of things that I hope Creative Assembly to improve on with respect to this race. Just revamping offices, changing the economy situation, changing the treasure system, and all that kind of stuff. Christine signing out. Stay tuned for more.